Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take the complicated and make it truly compelling, delivering the specific knowledge you need to be deeply informed.
Today we are undertaking what is probably our most difficult, but also our most critical mission.
A deep dive into the darkest architecture of the human mind. We're going to be peeling back the layers on clinical psychopathy and brutal savagery.
And we're drawing on some really extensive material, comprehensive scientific research, but also chilling first-hand correspondence with some of the most dangerous convicted killers in modern history.
Yeah, the sources are intense.
And our focus today is all about precision. This isn't for sensationalism. We are here to unpack the definitions, the crucial scientific distinctions between, condition and a choice.
And the diagnostic tools, right?
Exactly. Specifically, Professor Robert Hare's PCLR, which is used to analyze these individuals. Our sources span decades of really grim work.
Work that often required researchers to deal directly with homicidal psychopaths just to clear cold cases.
And that forced them to confront a terrifying reality.
Absolutely, and the weight of this research is just immense. The original author describes years spent corresponding with these offenders, and he realized he was constantly being pulled toward this vortex, a profound darkness.
An abyss.
It's a world of incalculable heartbreak, and the sheer gravity of what we're discussing, it forces us to start with a necessary philosophical caution.
A warning, really.
A warning, yeah. Delivered by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and it really frames this entire conversation.
Nietzsche's warning is the anchor for this entire deep dive, he said. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process, he does not become a monster. And when you look into the abyss looks into you.
The abyss looks into you.
And this deep dive is our attempt to understand the structure of that abyss, to distinguish between clinical psychopathy, which is a condition sometimes considered beyond overall control, and brutal savagery.
Which, crucially, the source material argues often has no such excuse.
We're looking for that dividing line.
That Nietzsche quote really, it underscores the personal toll, doesn't it? The psychological risk these researchers face.
It's not just academic.
No, it's an active confrontation with master manipulators. The research itself notes that profound psychological cost of just entering that world of darkness.
It's a very high-stakes environment,
right.
And psychopaths are, by their very definition, master manipulators.
So appealing to their better nature, that's a mistake.
A huge mistake. One of the first, starkest lessons researchers learn is that traditional appeals to guilt, morality, humanity, they're judged by the killer as nothing more than an intellectual error, a sign of weakness.
Because they just don't have the conscience to process guilt.
Exactly. They see those appeals as an opening, a vulnerability they can immediately exploit for their own narcissistic gain.
So if you show humanity, they see a target.
Which required researchers to adopt these incredibly unconventional, even shocking, tactics to gain access to their minds.
And this brings us to one of the most fascinating pieces of correspondence in the sources. It's called A Letter from Professor Annabelle Lee.
Right. Professor Lee, who is identified as an FBI supervisory special agent and a professor of criminal justice.
And she recognized that traditional methods were failing.
They were failing because they assumed the killer possessed some kind of moral core.
She argued that if you want a serial killer or a rapist to talk, you have to recognize their own specific perversions, their own narcissistic needs.
They don't learn from their mistakes in the way normal people do. So her recommendation was to adopt this highly specific, multisensory approach when you're corresponding with them in prison.
Multisensory? What do you mean by that?
It's a strategy that bypasses the rational mind entirely, and it targets the primal centers. It uses 3 elements: the written word, photographic visual stimuli.
Tailored to their victim type.
Conforming to their victim type, yes. And most creatively, smell.
Smell. Okay, break that down for me. The sensory manipulation. For a female killer, for instance.
For a female killer, the letter should have a photo that, conforms to their victim type. Something that evokes a memory of the crime, or the high of the crime.
And then the smell part.
Then the researcher applies a distinct, often expensive spray of cologne or perfume to the actual paper.
And the theory behind that is what?
It's chillingly logical.
Oh.
That scent is going to linger in their cramped cell long after the words have been read.
And because smell is so closely tied to memory.
And to the primal emotional centers of the brain, yeah. That scent literally makes the letter stand out from all the official prison mail. It brings back visceral memories of what they would consider better days.
Successful, exhilarating days for them.
It creates an immediate, unforgettable, and deeply personal connection.
And the sources say what works for female killers works even better for men.
Oh, even better. A splash of perfume, or, to be more blunt, a sexy photograph tailored to their specific fixation practically guarantees a reply.
It's pure, calculated psychological leverage.
Designed to appeal directly to their aggressive narcissistic needs and their sexual compulsions. The goal here is information access, not rehabilitation.
And we have a specific anecdote of Professor Lee using this tactic.
We do, with serial killer John J.R. Robinson. And she justifies this highly, non-professional but obviously effective approach by stating that based on his criminal history.
I remember this line.
Mr. Robinson's thought processing system seems, for the better part of his life, to have been hung between his legs.
That statement just strips away all the academic pretense, doesn't it? It gets right to the core. If you want to understand the machine, you have to feed the machine exactly what it craves.
And we know this approach gets terrifying results. Which brings us back to the chilling reality of dealing with these men. We see it in some of the excerpts.
Like the correspondence with inmate HP 2510, Michael Benjamin Sams,
the notorious serial killer and abductor.
He wrote this letter discussing his daily prison routine watching football on TV, just the utter mundanity of it all.
And then in the same breath, he offers a prison visit to the author because, this is a quote,
"The security arrangements here at HM Prison Full Sutton are slack."
The chilling part isn't the violence, that's historical. It's the sheer, cold calculation. He's observing the system, he's analyzing security weaknesses.
And offering access as a power play.
All while just, living the mundane life of a prisoner. It's the banality of evil in action.
And then there's that quote from Detective Russell J. Kruger.
Right, who confessed that the author of the source is a Brit. Scares the crap out of me.
And why? Specifically because the author successfully opened up the mind of the killer Harvey Kerrigan after psychiatrists had just utterly failed.
And Kruger described Kerrigan as the fucking devil and lamented that he should have been fried years ago.
These anecdotes just show that engaging with these individuals means dealing with men who aren't just terrifyingly violent,
but are also capable of spotting institutional weaknesses. Whether it's the security at a maximum security prison or a tiny flaw in a researcher's moral or professional armor, they are always testing.
Always manipulating the system.
Always.
Okay, let's pivot now from the tactics of engagement to the history of the concept itself. If these men are master manipulators, how did we get to the point where we could clinically define what they are? For centuries, this was all just labeled as moral failure, right?
Exactly. The journey to defining the psychopath shows that people have long recognized this profound internal defect, even when they lacked the neurological language for it.
So the official history begins with recognizing a personality defect that's separate from traditional madness.
And that starts back in the 18th century, with the French psychiatrist Philippe Pinel and his concept Manie sans délire.
Which means insanity without delusions.
And this was revolutionary. Pinel observed sufferers who appeared outwardly normal. They didn't have hallucinations or memory loss like you'd associate with psychosis, but they were prone to violence and completely lacked impulse control.
So he was the first to separate the idea of mental illness that manifests purely in behavior and emotion, rather than a failure of, say, cognition.
Yes. This idea that you could be sane, yet morally defective, was startling at the time.
And that idea was refined later on.
In 1835, by the English physician James Cowles Pritchard, he coined the term moral insanity.
Moral insanity.
He described it as a morbid perversion of the natural feelings, with no observable disorder. Crucially, Pritchard recognized that the individual have a solid grasp of reality, they understand right and wrong.
But they act without restraint, as if they're unable to translate that knowledge into appropriate behavior.
It's like a moral black hole. And it wasn't until 1891 that the German doctor J.L.A. Koch gave it the formal terminology we use today. Die psychopathischen Minderwertigkeiten.
Psychopathic inferiorities.
And that really established the condition as a personality defect.
Decades later, the clinical description was really cemented by people like Dr. Richard Krauss, who gave us that famous description of the psychopathic exterior.
The mask of sanity.
Yes, the mask of sanity. How does that mask actually manifest?
Well, the mask is crucial to their success. The psychopath is typically smooth, verbose, glossy, neat, Artificial.
Controlled, but also controlling.
Intensely controlled in their presentation, but constantly controlling of others, yes. They live these superficial, often highly destructive lives, all while presenting this convincing facade of normalcy in competence.
I think it was Dr. Martin Blinder who captured that essence. He noted that the psychopath at first glance seems quite well put together.
No delusions, a solid grasp of reality. But the defect is chronic. An inability to conform to social norms, to defer gratification, or to form any meaningful reciprocal relationships.
They lack the social cement that binds the rest of us.
Exactly. And this defect, it doesn't just appear overnight. The source material talks about an incubation period.
A predictable graduation process.
Right. And it's particularly tied to sexually motivated crimes. It's a ladder of increasing desperation and violence.
It often starts with minor crimes, maybe petty theft.
And then it escalates into voyeurism, the peeping Tom, which gives them sexual gratification but at a distance. Then they move to stalking, then sexual assault, rape, and finally,
serial homicide, driven by that need for greater and greater stimulation.
And the source stresses that many of these fantasy-driven offenders are fueled by pornography into an increasingly downward spiral.
The core motivation, then, is this intense, singular desire to take whatever they want, whenever they want it.
Regardless of the consequences to anyone else, they suffer from these feelings of entitlement and deprivation that just alienate them from the rest of humanity.
So they grow up without a functioning social conscience.
They're the supreme con artist who only truly cares about satisfying their momentary impulses.
Let's explicitly outline the core psychopathic traits that drive this escalation. What are the fundamental psychological pillars?
Well, first, there's a total inability to recognize the needs or rights of others. Their emotional radar is sensitive only to their own needs and desires. Everyone else is just an object to be used.
Second, a profound inherent lack of guilt.
No remorse, no inhibitions, no restraints. This is that physiological deficit that frees them from the brakes that conscience provides for the rest of us.
They don't feel bad about their actions, only about getting caught.
Precisely. And third, they understand societal rules and laws perfectly well. They are sane, but they actively choose to override them to satisfy their private passions.
The source summarizes their operating ethos as,
I don't care, I'll have what I want when I want, so fuck you. It's a conscious rejection of the entire social contract.
So they are rational but perverse. Their killing is often driven not by mental incapacity, but by this ruthless pursuit of sexual gratification and kicks.
And their lack of anxiety or guilt helps them maintain that mask and deflect suspicion. But eventually, their constant need for stimulation causes them to get reckless, and that's when they expose themselves.
This brings us to a crucial distinction the source material really emphasizes: the difference between a clinical psychopath and what it terms a savage.
Yes.
Now, this is a tricky pivot because to the average person, those terms might seem interchangeable. So why does this distinction matter beyond just, semantics?
It matters deeply because it defines the source of the evil. Psychopath relates to clinical concepts, a diagnosed, defined personality condition, which may suggest factors beyond one's overall control, even if they are still responsible for their actions.
But savage is different.
The term savage is used when such a medical diagnosis either can't fully explain the act, or when the individual demonstrates a deliberate, willful abandonment of the social contract.
So let's trace the etymology of savage. It comes from the Latin silvaticus, meaning of the woods.
And the source is very wise to insist we must discard the old colonial racially charged definition of that word.
We have to focus on the useful modern behavioral definition,
which is a brutal or violent person. And critically, a cruel or fierce person who is ignorant or neglectful of the rules of good behavior.
And that neglect of the rules is what separates the human savage from an animal.
Right. Animals act purely on instinct for survival. They follow natural law, not social law. The human savages discussed here commit their crimes not for survival, but through brutal, unrestrained violence, actively rejecting society's laws even when they know them.
So the modern savage in this context combines two elements:
brutal and unrestrained violence, coupled with an incapacity to understand or a willful transgression of the laws and rules of society.
Which comes down to a lack of conscience.
The moral sense of right and wrong, yes.
Okay, I have to pause here and challenge this a bit. If the psychopath has no conscience because of a neurological deficit, isn't labeling someone a savage an individual who commits a willful transgression? Isn't that just a moral judgment dressed up as a classification?
That is the precise intellectual tension that the source material explores, and concedes that neurologically, the savage may share many traits with the psychopath, especially the lack of empathy and emotional depth.
But the focus is different.
The focus is on the judicial and behavioral consequence.
So what difference lies in the excuse that's given in court?
Exactly. The psychopath suffers from a condition that suggests an intrinsic, maybe even a congenital defect. The savage, by this definition, has no such excuse, because their actions show a degree of calculated brutality and disregard for basic human rules that just transcend the clinical definition.
They are rational actors choosing profound evil.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
And we can see this distinction illustrated powerfully in judicial findings. Take the case of Oscar Pistorius.
Justice Eric Leach highlighted the inconceivable nature of his actions.
The judge noted that a rational, rule-abiding person would not fire a heavy-caliber firearm without issuing a warning shot, especially through a closed door.
So that highlights the brutal violence, coupled with a fundamental ignorance or rejection of the basic social rules that should govern handling a lethal weapon.
It perfectly fits the source's criteria for savagery.
Another powerful example is Melanie McGuire.
Convicted for the depraved murder of her husband, whom she dismembered and discarded, Judge Frederick DeVesa noted the depravity of this murder and her total disregard for the laws of what is acceptable.
She sacrificed her family for her own selfish ends.
The court focused on the calculated, inhumane nature of the act, that ultimate selfish rejection of all societal and familial norms. The judge's condemnation of her total lack of conscience, her moral sense of right and wrong, perfectly displays this type of savagery.
Her utter incompatibility with any civilized idea of good behavior.
She chose her own desires over the life and dignity of her spouse.
So the distinction is crucial. It asserts that while most people are capable of violence under extreme duress, the savage has abandoned the fundamental rules that allow society to function.
And combine that abandonment with profound, brutal violence, often in a context where their own survival isn't even at stake.
Okay, let's dive into what might be happening physically. We're shifting now to the still infantile science of the brain.
And the sources acknowledge that understanding the exact causation of psychopathy is far from resolved. Forensic experts often present conflicting theories.
But this area is highly contested, right?
Yes. But the theories offer compelling insights into the machine. We can start with neurological conflict. Recent investigations suggest a potential conflict between the amygdala, the brain's emotion and fear center, and the frontal lobe.
Which handles decision-making, judgment, control.
Exactly.
So, how does this conflict actually manifest in behavior? If the connections are weak, how does that produce a callous psychopath?
Well, the theory suggests that in psychopathic individuals, there's reduced connectivity between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a key part of the frontal lobe that regulates emotion and moral decision-making, and the amygdala.
So the emotional alarm bells, they don't fire properly.
They don't fire effectively from the amygdala, and they don't make it to the decision-making frontal lobe. So when they consider doing something aggressive or harmful, the fear, the empathy, the consequence signal, it's just not there.
It's essentially like the brain's brakes are disconnected from the engine.
That's a great way to put it. They can logically process the rules, the frontal lobe is functional, but they lack the emotional input from the amygdala that would normally lead to feelings of fear, remorse, or guilt.
Allowing them to act with that cold calculation.
And other biochemical imbalances are hypothesized as well, like a lack of serotonin, which is a major neurotransmitter impacting mood, impulse control, and emotional regulation.
And the sources also mention more complex concepts?
Yes. Things like hemispheric oscillation, which is the theory that the two halves of the brain might be communicating differently, perhaps less efficiently. When you get down to the level of axons and dendrites, the basic communication units of the brain, we're exploring how these structural flaws might lead to a lack of emotional control and impaired moral judgment.
Beyond just connectivity, there's the fascinating, if historically disputed, research on chromosomal abnormalities.
Dr. Arthur Robinson and Dr. Richard Krauss detailed findings about the XYY male, an individual with an extra Y chromosome in each cell.
Which means they carry an additional 100 million chromosomes.
And Dr. Krauss noted that initial studies suggested a 20-fold increase in the lifetime risk of an XYY male being institutionalized compared to the general male population.
But it's important to clarify the controversy around the XY factor.
Oh, absolutely. Early reports sensationalized the XYY male as a super male destined for violence. Later research refuted the idea that it directly causes criminality. The consensus shifted.
To what?
Dr. John Money added weight to what you could call the vulnerability hypothesis. He suggested that an extra chromosome in the nucleus of every brain cell somehow makes the individual inherently more vulnerable to mental and behavioral abnormalities.
So learning difficulties, impulse control issues.
Exactly, thereby contributing to the development of violent psychopathy, especially when you combine it with environmental stressors. It's a vulnerability, not a sentence.
And then there's the truly niche chemical anomaly known as the cryptopyrrole factor.
The hidden fiery oil.
Yes, highlighted in the case of serial killer Arthur John Shawcross. This is a deep dive into biochemistry.
This finding, detailed by Dr. Krauss, is remarkable. During lab examinations, Shawcross had what they called ballistic levels of cryptopyrrole in his urine.
Ballistic levels?
Up to 200 micrograms per 100 cc. To put that in perspective, the normal expected range is 0 to 20. This wasn't just elevated, it was dangerously high.
Let's break down that chemical. The name cryptopyrrole means hidden fiery oil.
And its chemical structure resembles other chemicals known to be toxic to brain function, like LSD.
So its presence in these abnormal amounts is a biochemical marker for psychiatric dysfunction.
It is. This excessive cryptopyrrole binds aggressively with essential micronutrients, specifically vitamin B6 and zinc, and it strips them from the body. This causes a metabolic defect called pyroluria.
Why are B6 and zinc so important, and how does their deficiency connect to psychopathic behavior?
Well, B6 and zinc are essential cofactors for creating and effectively using critical neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and GABA.
So if cryptopyrrole is blocking the body's ability to use B6 and zinc,
it directly impedes the production and regulation of these mood and impulse control chemicals.
A chemical deficiency creates a behavioral effect.
And the pyroluria theory offered a profound clue to Shawcross's psychopathy. Pyrolurics often function reasonably well in controlled, low-stress environments, like prison.
Which fits Shawcross's behavioral pattern. His diet and routine were strictly balanced there.
But his documented symptoms, the abnormal ECGs, nervousness, irritability, rages, violence, all correlated with these abnormally elevated levels.
So while the theory might be controversial in some circles, it suggests a profound physical component to his personality.
A toxic chemical invasion impacting his ability to control his behavior and emotions. It's a compelling idea.
It's clear that even if the science is in its infancy, researchers see the need to connect this horrific behavior to a quantifiable flaw in the human machine.
Rather than just defining it as a moral or spiritual failing.
Yes. Now we turn to the gold standard tool that finally brought some structure to this complex field. If history only gave us these vague labels like moral insanity, what is the current tool that brought scientific clarity?
That would be Professor Robert D. Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or PCLR.
Professor Hare, a highly respected researcher who frequently advises judicial systems and the FBI.
And his creation of the checklist was an effort to standardize the assessment, to make sure that when clinicians use the term psychopath, they're all measuring the same set of observable, quantifiable traits.
But Professor Hare himself is rightly cautious about it.
Oh, very. He is at pains to point out that the PCLR is absolutely not a test to be applied by non-professionals. It requires specialized training, access to extensive collateral information, and very careful scoring.
This isn't some simple personality quiz you find online.
Not at all. The checklist has 20 key traits. Each one is scored on a 3-point scale. 0 if the item is absent, 1 if it's partially present or uncertain, and 2 if it's fully present.
Yielding a maximum possible score of 40.
And in North America, the clinical threshold for labeling someone a psychopath is generally a score of 30 or above.
The PCLR is usually divided into 2 core factors, and understanding them is key to understanding the mechanism of psychopathy.
It is. Factor 1 focuses on the core personality traits, the interpersonal and affective components. These traits describe the psychological mask and the emotional deficits.
Okay, let's run through some of Factor 1, the heart of the psychopathic identity.
We have glibness, superficial charm.
Their ability to spin an incredibly believable, smooth narrative, like Dr. Shipman charming his patients.
Then there's a grandiose sense of self-worth, that overinflated ego.
Pathological lying, cunning and manipulative.
And the emotional deficits. Shallow affect, a restricted emotional range.
Lack of remorse or guilt, which is the foundational deficit.
And callousness, lack of empathy, the inability to feel another person's pain, viewing them as objects. And finally, failure to accept responsibility for their own actions.
So that's Factor 1, the inner life.
Exactly. These traits are generally considered the most diagnostic and the most resistant to change.
Then factor 2 covers the lifestyle and antisocial components. So this is the resulting erratic and criminal behavior.
This is the chaos in their lives. You have need for stimulation proneness to boredom. This constant need for excitement drives their impulsivity.
A parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral controls,
Lack of realistic long-term goals. They struggle to plan beyond immediate gratification.
impulsivity, irresponsibility. You see a pattern here.
Definitely. Then there are the historical markers. Early behavior problems, juvenile delinquency.
And their relational life, promiscuous sexual behavior, many short-term marital relationships.
And their criminal life. Revocation of conditional release and criminal versatility. They're generalists, not specialists.
So a high score on factor 1 suggests core, deep-seated psychopathy.
Whereas a high score on factor 2 alone might just indicate severe antisocial personality disorder, but without the specific emotional deficits of true psychopathy.
And Professor Hare insists that just having psychopathy doesn't mean a person will commit a crime.
Crime is always contextual, but these traits exponentially increase the likelihood of criminal behavior, especially recidivism.
And the source material has this fascinating, almost darkly comedic insight into the narcissistic preoccupation of these killers with their own diagnosis.
Keith Hunter Jesperson, the happy face killer.
Yes. After reading psychiatric literature, he deemed the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, to be bullshit from the bullshit.
But the most telling detail was his obsession with minute grammatical details in the correspondence he was having.
He wrote, demanding grammatical perfection from the author of the sources, saying, "While I'm at it, please pay more attention to your grammar. Inappropriate use of commas really annoys me."
He expects perfection from the outside world while denying the horror of his own actions.
That preoccupation, focusing on surface flaws like commas, entirely detached from the victims and the magnitude of his crimes, it perfectly illustrates that psychopathic need for control.
And the narcissistic inability to tolerate even minor imperfection, especially when that imperfection reflects on the world they are trying to manipulate, it links right back to grandiose sense of self-worth, PCLR number 2.
The sources repeatedly draw this inextricable link between psychopathy and aggressive narcissism, or narcissistic personality disorder, NPD.
A connection that is often clinically separated in academic papers, but profoundly overlaps in the behavior of these offenders.
So NPD symptoms, exaggerated self-importance, a preoccupation with personal inadequacy, power, prestige, vanity, they're nearly universal among these criminals.
And they are excessively dependent on admiration from others, which explains why Professor Lee's multisensory tactics, which cater to their ego and basest needs, are so effective.
A core defense mechanism they use is splitting.
Right. Maintaining an inflated self-concept, the ideal self, to guard against their terrifying actual self. This confused internal struggle makes them obsessively megalomaniac, believing they are owed entitlement.
We see this splitting so clearly in the case of Dr. Harold Shipman, the doctor from hell.
To his colleagues, he was a bullying megalomaniac, arrogant, intolerant of advice, convinced of his own superiority, classic narcissistic flaws.
But to his patients, he was the complete opposite. He maintained that perfect factor 1 mask.
Compassionate, available, the good doctor who would call even on a Sunday. His unassuming appearance, tweed jacket, spectacles, it masks an entity of distilled evil.
Allowing him to murder over 200 patients, completely undetected by dozens of medical professionals across 2 decades.
The Shipman case highlights how that narcissistic mask provides the ultimate deception. The sheer ability to maintain that dual life is characteristic of high-functioning psychopathy.
And his ultimate downfall was his entitlement.
Trying to fraudulently appropriate his last victim's estate just because he was arrogant enough to believe he could pull it off without consequence. PCLR number 2 and 8 right there.
The depths of this manipulation are further exposed in the case of Kenneth Bianchi.
The conman supremo and hillside strangler.
Bianchi, highly intelligent, attempted to use a psychiatric diagnosis as a calculated defense to escape punishment. This shows how sophisticated their game is.
Facing trial in 1979, he had closely watched the popular miniseries Sybil, which was about a case of multiple personality disorder, or MPD.
And he tried to fake it as a defense, following his attorney's advice to plead not guilty by reason of insanity.
During his hypnosis sessions, Bianchi adopted the Steve Walker alter ego. This persona spoke in a low voice, claimed to hate the court Ken, and confessed to the hillside stranglings.
Conveniently implicating his cousin Angela Buono.
And initially, even reputable experts like Dr. John Watkins believed they were witnessing a genuine MPD case.
Which just shows the incredible persuasive power of a master manipulator committed to a false narrative.
But the deception failed under the careful scrutiny of the prosecution's psychiatrist, Dr. Martin Orne.
Orne proved Bianchi was faking during his testing. He set a trap.
He arranged for Bianchi's non-existent Billy alter ego to speak to a non-existent lawyer. When Orne brought the real attorney into the room, Bianchi, trying to maintain the illusion of MPD, became profoundly confused.
He asked, "How can I see him in two places?"
Orne concluded Bianchi was not suffering from MPD. He was smart enough to adopt the persona, but lacked the comprehensive sophistication to maintain the deception under clinical pressure.
And finally, we have the ultimate master manipulator, Michael Bruce Ross.
An Ivy League Cornell student with an IQ of 150. Ross intentionally volunteered for execution after admitting his murders, executing a tour de force deception in the Connecticut judicial system.
Ross, who scored nearly perfectly on all PCLR categories, intentionally failed to accept responsibility number 16 only because it served his manipulative purpose.
He believed volunteering for the electric chair would screw up the entire system. He calculated that they don't fry mad people in Connecticut.
He wanted to be seen as the martyr who broke the machine.
And this complex strategy worked so well that a state psychiatrist, Dr. Miller, suffered sleepless nights and eventually withdrew from the case.
He wrote to the trial judge that his conscience weighed too heavily on him, fearing his diagnosis would push the switch.
Ross's ability to influence seasoned professionals and play the legal game demonstrates the profound depth of psychopathic control and his narcissistic need to dictate the terms of his own death.
He clung to that need for control and status to the very end, viewing his interactions with researchers as a chance to be center stage, an international serial killer bigwig.
All to satisfy his overinflated narcissistic ego. His Factor 2 traits, the criminal versatility, the irresponsibility, were just overshadowed by the calculated nature of his Factor 1 manipulation.
We've journeyed through the cold history, the contested science of the brain, the precise diagnostic methods, and the chilling reality of these criminal minds, drawing so heavily on first-hand accounts. What is the core essential takeaway for you, the learner, who has to reconcile this darkness with the expectations of the everyday world?
Well, the core takeaway is the terrifying impossibility of spotting these people based purely on generalized warnings. We have the sobering examples of high-functioning psychopaths like Dr. Shipman.
Undetected by dozens of medical professionals over years of systematic murder.
And we also have the example of sexual predators, like the deceased media star Jimmy Savile, who was given complete and unfettered access to hospitals and vulnerable populations despite persistent allegations.
All because his persona, that Factor 1 charm, was so overwhelming.
These individuals camouflaged themselves expertly. Shipman was the compassionate doctor, Savile was the celebrated media star and philanthropist.
They were both narcissistic, manipulative psychopaths hiding in plain sight.
Proving that we live in a world where we rarely suspect evil is coming our way because it wears such a glossy mask.
This leads to the painful consensus presented in our sources.
That psychopathy is generally considered untreatable and savages cannot be tamed. Therefore, the focus has to shift entirely from treatment to vigilance and awareness.
Our greatest defense then, especially in our own relationships, professional or personal, is recognizing the specific red flags of aggressive narcissistic behavior.
Which are the Factor 1 traits in action. This includes blatant lying, threats of violence, unreasonable control, and unfounded jealousy. These can signal a metamorphosing psychopathy that must be avoided at all costs.
Because the psychopath and the bullying narcissist are, at best, weak and lonely individuals who only have one thing in mind: themselves.
And the sources warn us that we must accept that this level of darkness lurks among the healthy, decent, and honest lives of the majority.
That acceptance is a stark but necessary conclusion, one that demands constant vigilance rather than naive trust. We'll leave you now with the final cautionary principle drawn from the Proverbs included in the source material, a thought for you to carry forward.
The naive person believes every word, but the shrewd one ponders each step. The wise one is cautious and turns away from evil, but the stupid one is reckless and overconfident.
Until next time, keep pondering each step and keep diving deep into the knowledge that matters.